back to the Communist Party bureaucrats who bought the enterprises. Were these buyers selected by the CP, or were they given preferential terms?
I mean, they weren't selected by the CP in the sense of, like, you know, having an official, you know, Congress voting on specifically who would get what necessarily, but there were obviously a lot of backroom deals that were cut. There were obviously people with more influence in the party were able to make a lot of these acquisitions. And yes, they were conducted on very preferential terms, particularly in terms of the way in which in industries where shares were given out to across the workers to be able to consolidate those.
All right. Can you talk about some of the political implications of Socialist Resurgence's analysis that China is imperialist for revolutionaries, specifically for revolutionaries in the US, but also in semi-colonies?
All right, so I think, first of all, recognizing that China's an imperialist power means that we have to recognize that it's going to have a major voice in world events, that it's going to be, that there's going to be, you know, inter-imperialist conflict between China and other powers, between other powers and China. It also means that for a lot of workers across the world, they are going to have to experience and confront the investments of Chinese monopoly capital. For instance, in Greece, I discussed the port of Piraeus earlier. That's something where the Syriza government actually had you know, promised to halt the privatization of Piraeus in terms of the halt that process. But when it came to power and was faced with the really stark refusal from the Troika to engage in anything other than demanding the most stringent austerity, it turned to China as this alternative and decided to rescind its opposition to the privatization of the port. And so I think as revolutionaries who recognize that China is an imperialist power, we would be able to say to that we don't see China as a progressive alternative in the world. We see China as, you know, another imperialism, and that concessions to one imperialism will not, you know, fundamentally liberate people around the world. Yeah.
Okay. A couple more questions here. We're getting, I think, close down to the end. From Max, we have, it's not clear to me that Russia is fully imperialist, nor China, or even if they are, and if they are, it's nothing like the reach and threat to the world in general compared to US imperialism. You want to address that?
Sure. So Russia, I think I'm gonna, that's, you know, you could do one of these classes just on Russia. So I guess I just advise you, Socialist Resurgence does also have a document on Russia on our website. I advise you to take a look at that and see why we argue that it's an imperialist power. But I would say this idea that, you know, well, they're weaker than US imperialism, I'd agree with that. The United States is, by a pretty wide margin right now, the strongest world power economically, especially militarily, in the world today. But that doesn't mean that it's the only imperialist power in the world and the only force that has an impact on events. I think if you compare China to a power like, you know, France or Britain or Germany, you start to see that, yes, it is actually a very serious player in the world. And like I talked about, we are starting to see sort of the fragmentation of this old alliance that was led by the United States against the Second World, of the United States against the Soviet Union. And we start to see increasing disputes between the United States and its allies in Europe and in Asia. And so I think this idea that we're just always going to have this, U.S. imperialist power that totally dominates everything, I think really misses a lot of the key developments in the world in the last 10 or 15 years. And just because China is a weaker power than the United States does not mean that it's an irrelevant power.